Hello. It was great being here. It's an amazing event. Um, to be honest, looking back a few years, I had no idea that this event could turn into something like this. I remember the first years we were sponsoring this event on the beach. It was just a few hundred people there, and it's amazing what could happen just in a few years. So the topic is building blocks, and the second part of it is a tipping point, and I'll try to touch on both of them. So about the building blocks, Tony Fadell, the man that was leading the team at Apple Computers at the time when they were creating the first iPod device, often tells the story that when Steve wanted that device, all the pieces, all the building blocks were there in place. The screens were there, the memory were there, the chips, everything was in place. There was one piece missing, and that piece was microdrive, and they were able to find a supplier that had the right type of device, worked with them over some time, and eventually this unleashed what we all see today as a revolution in personal compute devices. So since I'm in Tel Aviv in Israel, I'm going to start my speech with a maisa, with a story. A few years back in Israel, we were approached by a few people, some of them in the audience right now, with an idea of an advanced automotive sensor. So to me, the idea was a little bit far-fetched, so we had some conversations over a few months. What I've learned over the period of time of a few months that we had conversation with the team and investors is there's a really dedicated team behind it. A team can take pretty much any idea and turn it into the reality. What they really needed is a little bit of a direction how to deal with this messy automotive industry and how things going in automotive, and get a little bit direction on what specifications should be, what the commercial targets should be. And then to make a long story short, after about 10, 11 months that they finally had the first demo prototype, we felt confident enough to become the first strategic investor in this company. Why am I telling you this story? Well, this is essentially about the building blocks. This company was very clear to me, was on the verge of starting to work on a very important building block in the future autonomy. This is not working. The change. It's the most important thing in life that drives us. So looking back 7, 10 years ago, if we had the same event in Tel Aviv, probably most of us would fit in a coffee shop down the street. And look, today we're in a venue where the Eurovision was held. That's incredible. So here's another incredible story about automotive industry and the pace of change in automotive. Mary Anderson, I don't know how many of you know this name in the audience, was the woman that invented a windshield wiper. She came up with this idea when she was in New York on a trip. She patented it in 1903. It took 19 years until 1922 until the first automotive company, it was Cadillac at the time, made it a standard feature on all of their vehicles. So coming back to modern days, a couple years ago, there was a story with a premium automotive OEM, European OEM, that had a cybersecurity threat that was threatening the entire fleet of their vehicles. It took a company and some suppliers around it just a few weeks to identify the threat, figure out what needs to be done, and implement it across the entire fleet. The pace of what's happening in the automotive industry has changed dramatically. And I personally believe a lot more to come. So Bill was here on the stage, and a lot has happened in the automotive industry in the last 100 years. Well, it started with a Ford Model T that essentially brought affordability to the masses of a personal transportation. Then we had a period of time when it was a time to find ways to save millions of lives by creating the safety mechanism in the vehicles. Things like three-point seat belt, airbags, the improvements in the materials and the construction of the body and weight itself. And in the last decade, we've been going through another revolutionary change that has to do with the CO2 emissions, the battery technologies, looking for a more sustainable personal transportation. I think the point to all of this is I personally believe, and I believe that majority of people in this room and outside of this room believe that the more fun is yet to come. I believe that we are going through right now in the biggest change in automotive industry in the last 100 years. So if I can get this thing working properly. Anybody? Oh. So I talked a second ago about the drastic change in time, how the pace of the change in automotive industry is moving faster. But it's not just the time. The domain itself is expanding drastically. Today, we're no longer talking about just the vehicle itself when we're talking about the transportation. That field is expanded dramatically into the other fields and covering the entire field of ecosystem of mobility. So technologies that wouldn't be related to automotive just a few years back are becoming critical to this entire ecosystem. The other epicenter of that discussion is the ownership models of vehicles. Today in the Western world, it is predominantly personal ownership of the vehicle, and that's what drives the volumes of cars that we produce. But the process already started in years to come that ownership will become mixed. We start seeing the ride-hailing usage. We start seeing the more usage of public transit in a mixed environment with the private ownership. And things like data, mapping, charging infrastructure will become more important to the mobility. So mobility will be much more than just simply getting in a vehicle and getting from point A to point B. So why is this important to this audience? Well, I believe that's important because it brings even more opportunities for new problems to solve. Just to name a few, if you start thinking of the mobility as an ecosystem, a short list of well-known gaps and problems could start with localization in dense inner city environments, solving problems with that has to do with commercial viability of a technology coming to the autonomy. And my personal favorite is figuring out the congestion in the inner city without creating more problems with parking and more problems with running costs. We as a large tier one, and I haven't made this introduction assuming that most people in Israel know about Magna, but maybe it's worth spending 20 seconds on what Magna is. We're not just the largest automotive supplier in North America, north of $40 billion in revenue. We're not simply the most diversified tier one. We touch everything when it comes to the vehicle, with exception maybe of tires. We're the only tier one that has a capability of engineering and building the entire vehicle. But more importantly, Magna's DNA is very similar to DNA of most of the startups on this floor here. It's probably best known culturally as a $40 billion startup. Has to do a lot with our founder and the history of the company. So within the company, we concentrate on things that we know the best. We work on things in the body in white, work on things in closures and powertrain systems and ADAS systems, and on the future of autonomy, where we fully understand and realize that without the startups that create new technologies like yourselves here, that we may not find all the building blocks that we're looking for. So how do you go about doing this? Well, just like with everything else, it starts with a vision. And the vision in this field could be as clear and as simple as solving congestion problems or solving energy problems. And by energy, I mean autonomy doesn't come for free. Autonomy is an expensive thing in terms of power. So how do you trade between the available mileage on a vehicle and how much you spend on the autonomous stack? Problems of cybersecurity. You find the gaps, technological gaps that exist within that vision. You build a technical path, a viable technical path to a product. And my favorite, and anybody from the VC world would know that this is my favorite, is how do you make it commercially viable? What is the business case behind it? But all these things are irrelevant if you don't have the team in place. The key to every successful startup is the team can implement it. And I would say whenever people ask me what is the secret behind the startups that you've worked with, and worked with many of them, Argus Cybersecurity was one of the first Israeli startups I got involved in and had a successful exit a couple years ago as one example, and there are many more others. So using that as an example, the key to a successful startup is team. You can always pivot an idea, you can always adjust to what's going on, but without having the team in place that can relentlessly implement an idea and a vision, you don't have anything. So the pivotal moments, there are many names for that terminology, but to me, the moment itself is not critical. It's not important to know when it's going to happen. The important piece is if you want to stay in this business, and this is a tough business to stay in, you have to be ready with the building blocks. And that's sort of the point of what I'm trying to say here today. So, going back to the beginning of my speech, if you recall that advanced sensor company that I mentioned in the very beginning, many of you may recognize from the story. I was talking about Innoviz. Innoviz is an Israeli startup that we've partnered with and we're the first strategic investor in, and now several years later, we're working together on a first production program, volume production program for a solid-state LiDAR with a premium European OEM. They've raised $170 million to date, and they're doing fantastic. And the reason why we're here today is to find among yourselves a building block similar to this startup company and find ways to work together. With that, I wanted to thank you, and let me do this right. L'Shana Chabad Tel Aviv.